Good afternoon. It's really a great pleasure and honor for me because I'm just standing. This university is outstanding, so I'm really pleased and honored to have this opportunity to present my invitation for a discussion, actually, not a real lecture. A discussion that begins with a topic deeply ingrained in Eastern European historical experience, but what is probably even more important, the experience recreates itself once again in contemporary Eastern Europe. So the experience which I want to present here very briefly, of course, and due to this briefness superficially, is an experience of being, to a degree, yes, betrayed. Betrayed by Western powers that look coldly how weaker countries in Eastern Europe are, so to speak, overtaken by their immediate powerful neighbors. But why betrayed, actually? What kind of an experience it is? Well, beginning with a more narrow Polish perspective. When you look into Polish 1 millennium old history, you can see that Poland is placed between two most powerful cultural ethnic communities in Europe. To the west, German community, much older than any Slavic community in its historical presence on the European continent, and at the same time very energetic, very active throughout centuries, and the most numerous actually on the European continent. With one exception, to the east of Poland we have, and we had also, a unity of Eastern Slavic tribes, peoples, that in the beginning formed the unity of Kievan Rus. Taken together, it was by far the most numerous, in terms of population, country in Europe around the year 1000. So being placed among two most powerful, most numerous, and really very active historical ethnic communities that survived and exist nowadays as Russia and Germany is not an easy task to survive 1000 years. And in this experience of fighting for survival in this particular area, there is a very deep streak of both political but also cultural traces connected with both the fights for independence and this ethos of fighting for liberty, and losing this fight so many times, being eliminated from the map, political map of Europe. To sum up very briefly this introduction, I would say that one of summarizing verses in Polish poetry can be quoted from Zbigniew Herbert's poem, the one, I mean verse, in which he speaks, ironically of course, about a comforting experience of being alone vis-à-vis powerful empires, being without help. But once again, why in both Polish culture and in Polish experience there is this element of being betrayed by the West? Were there any alliances, were there any obligations by powerful empires of Western Europe towards Eastern Europe, towards Poland, for example? Well, we can answer briefly, not very frequently. The main, I would say, underlying element that stresses that subjective feeling of being betrayed is connected with the specific auto-definition of Poland and also other Eastern European countries, such as Hungary, for example, such as contemporary Czech Republic, such as Lithuania, and to a degree, in some way, also in Ukrainian experience, it is also deeply ingrained. As a Western European or Latin world bulwark, or antemurale as it was called in old times, vis-à-vis Eastern world, connected to the Eastern Orthodox tradition and to Russian, first Muscovite, then Russian Tsardom, then the Soviet Union, treated as a kind of, from this particular perspective, as a kind of alien power opposed to old Europe, to Europe, put it shortly. And this particular perspective we can find, once again, to broaden our scope, in contemporary Ukraine, that declares her will to join Europe or to rejoin Europe, to follow this historical experience that unites Ukraine with Europe from Kievan Rus times through more than 4 centuries long period of cohabitation, very difficult cohabitation, one must acknowledge, within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that extended many of Western European traditions, experiences into Ukrainian lands. For example, I give you one example. In Kiev, you can find a very unique monument built to Magdeburg law, the law which was introduced first in Poland in 13th century, 14th centuries, to organize a new Polish towns, Polish cities, according to a new, more developed, modernized system adapted from Germany, just modern town. And this law was adapted through Poland to Ukrainian lands, and Ukrainians were already proud of this link with Europe. Already 200 years ago, when the monument was erected, it was restored 3 years ago in Kiev. Very unique monument dedicated not to any person, but to an abstract idea of law, European law, one can say shortly. So this element of will, of intention, of idea, of to join Europe, to be part of Europe, being so deeply ingrained not just in Poland, but also in several other countries of the region, Eastern European or East Central European region, placed between Russia and Germany, is just a very important element of, I would say, self-definition of the region. And this makes this particular obligation, one could say, exported or emitted to Western European powers, so vivid in Eastern European memories. And of course, from Polish experience, we can remind very particular one experience of dismemberment of 3 consecutive partitions of Poland in the second half of 18th century, when Poland disappeared from the map, dismembered by 3 Eastern and Central European powers, Russia, Austria, and Russia, which took 82% of the pre-partition territory of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And this 1.5 century, almost 1.5 century of existence without its own state was important not just for Poles, not just for all, I would say, nations or nations in the making that could be treated as inheritors of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And here I mean not just Poles, but also Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Belarusians, and Latvians, because all these nations stem from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth territorially and in their particular historical, several centuries old experiences. They also share this experience of partition, of being overtaken by powerful imperial neighbors, and in their will to find new ways for political and cultural existence in closer relations with Europe. But the experience of being deprived of political liberty, of any possibility of realizing any particular nation in the region of its political will, was also important from outside perspective. For Western European empires, political elites in Paris, London, or afterwards also when Italy united itself in Rome, there was this 1.5 century very important experience that there exists nothing between Germany and Russia, that there is just a border, that there is no place for any countries there, but just two powerful and stabilizing, actually, empires, stabilizing at the cost of actually quelling all national movements in the region, suppressing subsequent rebellions or revolutions in the region that were motivated by that will of independence. So these two experiences, one of the nations from the region that wanted to find their own independence, and they found opportunity with World War I to get this independence, when these three empires occupying East Central Europe lost actually together World War I. This particular point of a chance to realize this dream of regaining or gaining for the first time real political independence for the region, for the countries of the region, clashed first with a perception from the West. The perception built up especially in the previous 2 centuries, 18th century, when the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was really weak and was manipulated from Russia, dominated first by Russia, then just occupied by Russia, and the 19th century, when there was no other state in the region but just Russia, and on the western fringes of the territory, the Second Reich, Germany. So there we can begin our, so to speak, real story. The story that begins, story of appeasement, that begins with World War I. Because when you hear this word, appeasement, probably you can connect it in the first impulse with Munich Conference 1938, when Western European powers, with the United Kingdom in the first place, and the Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, along with French Edouard Daladier, accepted real aggression executed by the Third Reich, by Germany, at the coast of Czechoslovak Republic. And there, in Munich Conference in September 1938, there were these infamous words uttered, words by Neville Chamberlain, that we do not, that means Western Europeans, Brits, we don't want to fight for a faraway country about which we know nothing. These words, this is exact quotation, were addressed to Czechoslovakia, that this is faraway country about which we in Great Britain know nothing. And actually, Neville Chamberlain came back to Britain with Munich Agreement, which dismembered Czechoslovak Republic, depriving it of 1/5 of its territory, the most vital Sudetenland, and was greeted by hundreds of thousands of his co-citizens enthusiastically, and then he was able to declare that he brought back peace with honor, meaning Munich Agreement. Well, our perception changed, and the British perception changed very quickly. Actually, in March 1939, when after several months it was clear, when Hitler decided to break Munich Agreement and to divide finally and totally Czechoslovakia, paving way for further aggressions against Poland, against the rest of East Central Europe, that this act of appeasement, of giving Hitler green light to occupation of an independent country in Eastern Europe, was not a wise move, that it didn't stop him, that that faraway country that was divided with, I would say, acceptance of Western powers, is quite close to Western powers, that the aggression that overtook Czechoslovakia, then Poland, would come sooner or later to Paris and London, that it was necessary to stand up to the task of defending not just Czechoslovakia, but himself or herself in London or Paris, in Western Europe. That appeasement was a short-sighted policy. This we know, everyone probably here, not just here, can connect this term appeasement with Munich Conference and its rather infamous peace. Of course, in Poland we have almost immediate, I would say, connection, not just in Poland, but also in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, to connection to the word appeasement that extends from Munich Conference to Yalta Conference in 1945, when three leaders of the anti-fascist coalition met in the Crimea in order to organize Europe anew in the after-war perspective. And the decisions taken in Yalta, at the Yalta Conference, actually left all countries of Eastern Europe with consent, especially of the American President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, to Stalin. They left, I mean Roosevelt and Churchill, but Roosevelt had the most powerful arguments he didn't use to stop Stalin anyhow from this. So both Western countries that were present at Yalta and their leaders, especially Roosevelt, decided to left this region to Stalin's will, knowing quite well what this meant for the countries interested, or rather feared, of that verdict. Franklin Delano Roosevelt uttered at Yalta Conference no less, I would say, infamous words as Neville Chamberlain in Munich. Franklin Delano Roosevelt declared to Stalin at Yalta in March 1945 that Poland has been a source of troubles for us for 500 years now. It was very interesting, I would say, statement for a president of a country that existed at that moment less than 170 years. Nevertheless, he perceived any independence between Soviet Union, Russia at that time, and Germany as a source of troubles, constant troubles for real makers of world politics. So this was another example of appeasement, to appease Stalin with Eastern Europe in order, with hope, that he would stop there. And to a degree, one can accept this perspective that it paid off. Stalin nor his successors have not invaded Western Europe, though they invaded many countries in other parts of the world, in Asia, in Africa, and also in this hemisphere, in the Western world. So they were not stopped completely. These two elements connected to appeasement as a problem are very frequently quoted as example of the issue, of the problem of appeasement. However, I would like to step back in order to show you the beginnings of this particular attitude, which is important now when we look at Ukraine, which lost Crimea, overtaken militarily by Russia, and now is in a very real danger of losing other territories, also overtaken militarily by Russia. And we are still waiting for the decision of Western powers, both the EU and the United States, whether they would accept this status quo as enforced militarily by Vladimir Putin. They would agree at some point, maybe this year, maybe next year, in another Munich or Yalta conference, that territorial changes enforced by Putin should be legalized, should be accepted, with hope that he would not go any further. Whether this perspective of appeasement addressed this time to Vladimir Putin would find its infamous place in the history of the 21st century. With this particular question mark, very important for contemporary situation, we can address, and we probably should address, how it began really, and when it began. And with that, we have to step back to World War I, because it is exactly the experience of World War I that motivated, in the first place, most powerfully, the ethos of appeasement. World War I was such a cruel experience, such a shocking experience to most Western European countries, especially France, but also Belgium, also the Great Britain, with almost 1 million young people killed in Britain, almost 2 million young people killed in France, and so on and so forth, that it seems absolutely obvious and natural that in reaction for such a carnage, mass carnage, there was an overwhelming feeling that no war can happen anymore, that we have to do, we in France, we in Britain, we have to do everything in order to avoid any new war. We can decide actually future of other parts of the world with this particular aim put on the top of our priorities list. No more war. And this pacifist sentiment that was absolutely understandable and obvious after World War I put Eastern European problems in a specific perspective. As I mentioned, in World War I, quite unexpectedly, all three empires that occupied all territories in the region, that is Austro-Hungary, that collapsed completely and irretrievably, but also Second Reich, that is Germany, and Imperial Russia lost. And in this particular situation, the countries that either existed there before 19th century, such as Poland and Lithuania, or new countries that wanted to gain their independence, like Ukraine, Latvia, Estonia, also Belarusia to a degree, wanted to grab this chance and to find their independence. But from a Russian perspective and German perspective, having lost the war, there was this very important, very powerful drive to regain what was lost, to retake what was lost due to the course of World War I. And this revisionist attitude, quite evident in Germany, but also, as I would like to stress and to show you in a minute, in the Soviet Russia that inherited geopolitically landmass of the Russian Empire, were very important factors that influenced Western European perspective on the region. If powerful nations such as Germany or Russia want to regain their control over these borderlands, bloodlands, as Timothy Snyder would call them appropriately as regards the 20th century history, then maybe we, that is Western European powers or the United States, should not stay on their way. Maybe we should leave this part of Europe to these traditional dominant powers that ruled over this huge landmass through the last centuries. And this particular perspective attached to this goal number one, to avoid any war, began the process of appeasement addressed to Germany first. The word appeasement appears for the first time in British press because the phenomenon appeasement began and was really influential, not in France at that time, but only in Great Britain and in the United States. It was Anglo-Saxon phenomenon at that time. It was mentioned in English, actually, press in the 1990 during the Versailles conference, the Paris Peace Conference in 1990. Exactly expressing this attitude that we should step back from our harsh conditions that we enforced on Germany, forcing Germany to leave territories that were inhabited predominantly by Poles, but also with some German minorities, such as Pomerania, such as Wielkopolska, and such as Silesia. Maybe it is unfair to take these territories with German minority from Germany. Maybe Germans should have their say on these territories. Maybe they are treated unfair with the final verdict of the Versailles peace. And this was actually the first, I would say, the first version of appeasement as an attitude. Anthony Lentin, British historian of international politics, in his recent study of David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of that time, policy, presented a very interesting systematics of appeasement as attitude. He, so to speak, expressed in the first time a phenomenon of what he called mea culpis among British, especially, and to lesser degree, some American representatives on Versailles or Paris, if you will, peace conference. Mea culpis meaning that this is our fault, that we treat Germans too harsh, giving German territories, meaning Silesia, Wielkopolska, or Pomerania, to Poland. Territories with German minorities, actually. That maybe we should be more mild to Germany because they fought gallantly against us. Of course, they inflicted upon us really heavy losses, but they were they should be treated as gallantly as any opponent in a fair, however cruel, war. And due to this particular moral, I would say specifically moral attitude of mea culpism, Antony Lentin dissociates, or rather pinpoints the first version of appeasement attitude as a kind of moral appeasement, that it is unfair actually to treat ex-empire by taking from it territories inhabited even by other population, non-German in this particular point, but traditionally treated as German, traditionally treated by Germans themselves as belonging to their proper sphere of dominance, that maybe we go too far. But this particular ideological, I would say, or moral appeasement was not that important as another form of appeasement, that is pragmatic appeasement, which stressed not that this is not unfair to treat Germany in this particular case this way, which meant independence for its eastern neighbors. But it is not pragmatic, it is not reasonable to treat Germany this way. Why? Because Germany would be powerful enough to regain these territories. And with that, Germany would be an important factor of destabilizing factor in European politics, fighting for the recreation of the pre-1914 territorial, so to speak, status quo. So in order to avoid this, in order to, so to speak, make Germany again an important element of European peace, rather than turning Germany into a fomenting factor of European unrest, many Western European, especially British and American statesmen at that moment, were prone to minimize any gains Poland have obtained from German, previously imperial German territories in Silesia, Pomerania, or Wielkopolska. And actually, even before the war ended, for the first time, the very idea of appeasement addressed to Eastern Europe was formulated by then Foreign Secretary of the British government. Already at the head of the government was David Lloyd George. And Foreign Secretary of that time was Arthur Balfour, whom you probably know from his Palestine declaration, allowing Jews to create their national home in Palestine in 1970. Several months before, in October 1960, during the war, planning the future after war, peace settlement, Arthur Balfour addressed a special, I would say very pragmatic, devoid of any moral overtones, memorandum to his Prime Minister, to David Lloyd George, declaring that any idea of creating new states between Russia and Germany, buffer states as he called them, would be detrimental to European peace and to British interests. Why? It was very clear, and he declared this very clearly. First, because if such a buffer state like Poland, he wrote about Poland, would be created, then Germany, devoid of a real powerful neighbor to the east, would be able to attack France again, having this particular buffer and not a powerful Russia as its eastern neighbor. So it is detrimental both for France and for Britain. Besides, Russia, having such a buffer to her west, rather than Germany, powerful Germany, would be able to turn to Asia with her conquests, to Asia where the main enemy of the Russian invasion, and the most interested country for stopping Russia from any invasion would be the United Kingdom, with its colonial empire, predominantly situated on Asiatic continent at that moment. So it is better that Russia and Germany would be coterminous, would have common frontier with nothing between them. It's just pragmatism. But Arthur Balfour added one more argument, which is even more important and more far-sighted, I would say, still in use, that in order to achieve stable peace for Europe, it is necessary to turn Russia to Europe rather than to separate Russia from Europe. So the closer Russia is to Europe, and for British statesmen, Europe began only with Germany, the real Europe. There was nothing beyond Germany, just peripheries of Europe. So in order to make Russia more European, it is better to place her as close to Germany as possible, to make Russia a real participant power of European order, rather than to turn Russia to Asia. And this particular argument has not just pragmatic but also ideological overtones. That it is good, of course, for a liberal order to make Russia, I would say, ordinary European liberal country, and that anything that stood on this way to make Russia ordinary liberal European country should be eliminated. Why? Because Russia is huge, powerful, important, and what stays or could possibly stay on her way to Europe, that is to Germany, is not important, not powerful, and can be overlooked or sacrificed to this higher goal of, I would say, European order, as seen from London, from Whitehall. To that particular perspective, which was shared by many, by majority actually, of the British establishment politicians at that time, as regards not just Germany but also Russia, when Russian Revolution erupted, and then the Bolshevik Revolution came and eliminated totally the old Russia, a new element of appeasement attitude came into force in Western Europe as regards the Soviet Russia now. That was connected with left-wing, liberal and socialist sympathies in the West for this particular experiment, as it was called at that time, that was tested in Russia by the Bolsheviks. They, as was said, among, for example, Labour Party that became for the first time really prominent in British Parliament in the elections of 1918, they, that is the Bolsheviks, should be given opportunity of trying peacefully this experiment of building, maybe a bit barbarous, but somehow humanistic in its distant goals at least, socialist experiment connected with specific Russian traditions. And this particular force that grew really rapidly, especially in the United Kingdom at that time, I mean through the Labour Party, was quite important in voicing this moral appeasement. Well, Russia makes something new, something great. Maybe there are victims of this great experiment, but they are trying something for all humanity. That is everything that tries to undermine this experiment or is against the goals of this experiment should be eliminated. And of course independence, bourgeois independence of Ukraine, bourgeois independence of Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, obviously also Poland, was something that was treated as detrimental to that particular huge, much promising Bolshevik experiment. For the left wing, not just extreme left wing, but for a broader spectrum of left wing public opinion in Europe, especially in Great Britain at that time. So when we take together these elements, we can understand how it happened. How did it happen, that in the 1920s there was the first stunning, actually, example of appeasement, totally forgotten, actually, nowadays, even among historians, but very much advanced. The appeasement executed by the British government, led by David Lloyd George, a very pragmatic, not moral, not ideological, but just pragmatic appeaser, both in direction of Germany. He was one of the main opponents of giving Poland Pomerania and Silesia in Versailles Treaty. He wanted to persuade Germans that they could accept the Versailles Peace without any misgivings. So David Lloyd George's government authored the first effort of appeasement, not just towards Germany. David Lloyd George was a keen appeaser also in 1938 and even 1939, declaring his support for Hitler, even after his invasion of Poland in September 1939. But going back to 1920, he executed the first advanced experiment in appeasement of the Soviet Russia. And you would be probably, most of you I think, start with this particular picture, the real picture of Westminster House of Commons, August 10th, 1920, when the Red Army was at the gates of Warsaw in its offensive that had as its goal to overtake not just the whole Poland, but also to reach Germany, to extend the Red Army workers' hand to German workers, to German revolution in the center of Europe, but over the dead body of Poland, as the order issued by the commander of the Red Army in this direction, Mikhail Tuchaczewski, declared in July 1920. So at that particular moment, when the Red Army stormed Warsaw, the capital of Poland, at Westminster, in the House of Commons, in the distinguished guests gallery, third person in the Soviet Politburo. Soviet Politburo at that time was very, I would say, exclusive body, which had only 4 persons in its board, so to speak. The first person was, of course, Lenin. The second was Trotsky. The fourth was Stalin. But the third in this hierarchy, Bolshevik hierarchy, was Lev Kamenev, deputy prime minister of the Soviet government and the real deputy of Lenin in government of the Soviet Russia at that time. And he was sent to London, invited by David Lloyd George already in April 1920, in order to establish first economic and then political relations with the United Kingdom, with Great Britain. And the main idea by David Lloyd George was to treat the Soviet Union as another, so to speak, emanation of Russia. Geopolitically, it was still Russia, and Russia had to be invited to the European political, not just economic table, to decide or co-decide future of Europe with France, with Great Britain, with Italy. So he wanted to invite as representative guests from the Soviet Politburo as possible, and he obtained, through Lenin's consent, such an important envoy from Moscow as Lev Kamenev. Kamenev went to London in order to obtain something different than just, I would say, Russian geopolitical say in the European table. He went there in order to foment revolution, of course, because Lenin, Kamenev, Trotsky and Stalin were all authentic revolutionaries at that time. They wanted to organize real European revolution through fomenting this revolution, especially in European industrial powerhouse that is in Germany, and from there emanating it into every direction of the rest of the European continent. Nevertheless, Lenin decided that Kamenev's visit to London could obtain a kind of a legal consent by Western powers for the final annihilation of Poland that existed for 1 year at that time, regaining independence in November 1918. So it was even more than 1 year. And that's why Kamenev was keen in presenting the situation on the Polish-Soviet front at that particular moment when the Red Army was at the gate of Warsaw, as a kind of liberation of Poland by the Red Army. And the conditions the Soviet army presented then to Polish government, conditions of a complete surrender, not just of giving up territories to the east of Bug River along so-called Curzon line, but conditions that meant total surrender and real Sovietization of Poland, creating from Poland the Soviet Republic, were presented to David Lloyd George on August 10th in Westminster. And after obtaining this particular offer by Lev Kamenev, David Lloyd George informed all the House of Commons, very much interested with the final result of his talks with number 3 in the Soviet Politburo. He declared that conditions presented by the Soviet Russia to Poland, and then I have to quote in order to be adequate, the terms were not nearly so severe as had been imposed by the Allies upon Germany and Austria. And he, that is Lloyd George, did not think that Great Britain could make war in order to secure better conditions than these. So he ordered British ambassador to Warsaw, Sir Horace Rumbold, to present the official statement of the British government that the British government gives advice to Polish government to accept Sovietization, to accept the fate of a Soviet attack victim. This was actually this which happened on August 10th, 1920, the first example of what would happen then in Munich in 1938, and what would happen in Yalta. But it didn't happen, we know, because Poles decided not to go along the advice of the British government, but they fought desperately alone against the Soviet invasion. And they were happy enough to win this particular battle of Warsaw and the whole war of the 1920s. With that particular and very unusual victory at the Battle of Warsaw, Poland defended not just herself, but also many other countries of Eastern Europe that would have had evaporated totally with the victory of the Red Army, or with the victory of the David Lloyd George appeasement of the Soviet government. I mean, such countries as Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, all these countries were enumerated in correspondence of Stalin and Lenin in that time as next Soviet republics that must be organized as quickly as possible after eliminating Poland. One can ask in this particular moment, so what was the goal of David Lloyd George? First, to avoid war by the Great Britain. We should not send any single soldier, but not also any single munitions transport to Poland in order to avoid even a pretext for a war with the Soviet Union to defend Poland and to defend the rest of Eastern Europe. And this we can understand to a degree. We should, I am trying to describe the main arguments of David Lloyd George version of appeasement. We should avoid also internal clash with the Labour Party, with left-wing opinion, over this particular Bolshevik experiment and its chances of survival. If we send any munition to Poland, to help Poland, then we would have to face a kind of internal rebellion of Labour Party, which was organized at that time in so-called committees of actions, blocking any even presumed transports of munitions to Poland. And thirdly, when Poland is eliminated or Sovietized, where there is no Eastern Europe but just Russia and Germany, we can count on the logic of the situation that we know from older times, that in Eastern Europe there is either Germany or Russia. And this makes situation in that region more or less stable. And we need stability in order to restore Europe, in order to restore European possibilities. And the last important element in David Lloyd George reasoning at that time was economic one. We need Russian minerals, Russian wheat. However, at that time there was no real wheat for export from Russia. David Lloyd George and his so-called specialist economic advisors believed that Russia is still a country of plenty that could export and feed all Western Europe. Well, the fact was that economic factor was also an important argument for appeasement of Russia. Russia can give us something for our money, of course, something that she has in plenty quantities, while the rest of Eastern Europe is not enough big economic partner for us to be treated as a kind of quid pro quo for Russia. So if we have to choose between Eastern European countries from the Baltic Sea to the Adriatic, we have to choose Russia. We have to decide to even influence Russia through our trade with her. So David Lloyd George launched for the first time, being the first among Western politicians, that particular goal that the change, internal change in Russia, in Soviet Russia, in totalitarian Russia, could be achieved via trade. That trade would somehow civilize or liberalize Russia, even Soviet Russia, the Bolshevik Russia. He had no sympathy for the Bolshevism. In contrast to Labour Party, he was liberal himself. But he believed that that strange experiment they are doing in Russia, that is the Bolshevik experiment, communist experiment, could be somehow diluted with quantities of economic exchange with Western world. And this particular reasoning, as you know, of course, was very important, would be very important in subsequent decades of trade between the West and the Soviet Union. When I remind that particular forgotten perspective on appeasement and its different, I would say, levels of arguments, its different versions that existed in the beginning, in the first half of the 20th century, I'm trying to open a discussion that concerns contemporary situation. We know, of course, that after 20 years after the Polish victory over the Red Army in Warsaw, Soviet Russia took her revenge, organizing a new political conference after Munich, that time with Hitler, so-called Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact in August 1939. So that worst scenario came true 19 or 20 years after Polish-Soviet war. And with that particular moment, the appeasement ceased to be the main, I would say, tenet as regards the Germany, because the Western world began its war against Germany. The appeasement with the Soviets became more important after World War II, and it actually offered, so to speak, the solution, a very uncomfortable, to say the least, solution for Eastern European ambitions, goals, and will of independence and of joining the West, Europe, in the after-war communist domination of the region, the Yalta system. But with the end of the Soviet regime in the 90s, we have again a situation like in 1918. Different nations of the region, such as not just Poland, but also Ukraine, Belarus, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Georgia, Armenia, and others, gained their independence. They wanted their independence, and they gained this independence. But for Russia, of course, it meant decrease. It meant loss of territories that, even though there were Soviet times before, Russia treated as their own, as territories which Russia was, so to speak, was used to treat as belonging to her sphere of dominance. And the West accepted this particular perspective. I would like to remind you a very infamous, so to speak, Kiev chicken speech of George Bush Sr. in Kiev, actually, August 1991, just 5 months before the final collapse of the Soviet Union, when the American president decided to declare to Ukrainian people that already decided that it wants independence, that independence is not a wise choice for Ukraine, that Ukraine should stay within the Soviet Union. It would be better for the benefit of stability of international relations. It was 1991, August 1991. It was a perspective shared by most of his advisors from Department of State and shared by most of, I would say, Western European politicians, that it is better to deal with the united Soviet Union as a partner, however difficult, than with multitude of tiny, or tinier at least, destabilizing new states. New Russia used this particular perspective that was still active, vivid among Western politicians in order to prepare through the next 23 years, up to 2014, her revenge, her revisionist politics. And now I want only to enumerate briefly these elements that were used by Russia in preparing new stage for appeasement. First, there is this discussion, unending discussion, about presumed United States pledge not to move NATO into Eastern European countries. This is presumed pledge done by George Bush Sr. during his Malta talks with Gorbachev already in 1990. Though there are still no written proofs of any particular pledge by the American president given to Gorbachev at that time, it is still a recurrent theme, subject of Russian pretenses towards the West, towards the States, that this presumed pledge was not realized. So there is moral appeasement. We were cheated by the West. The West should revive his mea culpa attitude. Then there is another element, just like the one addressed to Germany in Versailles after the Versailles Conference. There are many Russian minorities in new states created after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So maybe they are ill-treated, maybe they could be ill-treated, even if they are not in reality. So Russia should take care of an international order that would keep Russian minorities in such countries as Ukraine or Latvia or Estonia being somehow put under umbrella of international, I would say, control, of course exerted specifically by Russia herself. And this was the gist of so-called Balladur plan. The name was given by the French Prime Minister in 1992, Edouard Balladur, who accepted that perspective proposed by President of the Russian Federation, Boris Yeltsin, of giving Russia control over human rights, so to speak, violations and human rights observation, rather I should say, in post-Soviet countries. Well, it was almost as to give the wolf rights to control sheep rights, where he can control the violations and the observation of sheep rights among the sheep. Well, at this time, Boris Yeltsin found acceptance for his particular perspective that was reviving once again this attitude of mea culpism. There are these millions of Russians living beyond their own country borders that should be reminded to Western minds they are the real victims of the post-Soviet realities. We have to create an image of Russian minorities as victims, even though there were no real persecutions, no real second, I would say, second-rate treatment as second-rate citizens in most of the post-Soviet countries of these Russian minorities. Nevertheless, there was one more maybe important element connected to this mea culpism revived in Western countries. And this is cultural one. Just like for Germany, which I have not mentioned, for the post-World War I, mea culpism among Western politicians. Namely, that Germany is a country of a great culture. Nothing comparable was created in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, as was created in Germany throughout the ages. This was easily accepted. This kind of unfair, actually, perspective was easily accepted by the elites of Oxford, Cambridge, Paris, which knew something about Goethe, about Schiller, about Dr. Faustus, but were not really versatile, to say the least, or to put it ironically, with anything created in the matters of culture by, let's say, Chopin, Dvorak, Mickiewicz, Petefi, or other creators from East Central Europe. So this mea culpism was built also on this particular adoration, quite justified actually, of German cultural achievements, and not so justified denigration of those unknown achievements of East Central European countries. And this was recreated quite openly in the 1991, after 1991 period, vis-à-vis Russia. Russia is a country of Chekhov, of Tolstoy, of Dostoevsky, of Tchaikovsky. What comparable these new member states accepted to the European Union could offer to Europe? Now I am quoting an article from London Sunday Times from 2005, written by an American professor of literature, that it is a great mistake to accept new countries from Eastern Europe to Europe, that is to the EU, because it alienates Russia, which has a culture of much more European veneer and much deeper European, I would say, ambitions, better stressed by her cultural achievement than all combined countries, new countries of Europe taken together. Of course, once again, this, I would say, justified adoration of Russian culture in that particular case has been used in political sphere with absolutely unjustified, I would say, denigration of all cultural meaning and achievements of Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, and so on and so forth. So this all combined worked for this moral appeasement towards Russians. They were treated unfairly. That was the verdict. There was another, even more important type of, and there is actually, of appeasement addressed to Russia after 1991. It is motivated by the old instrument of economic pressure exerted by Russia. Now Russia has exactly material sources to be exported to Europe, and they are very important to Europe. And there is still this very effective mood among Western European, not just politicians, but business leaders, that we can do fantastic business with Russia. And for this particular goal, we can actually resign from any help, any obligations towards, for example, new members of the EU that feel endangered by Russian aggression. When we put on scale good business with Russia and obligations to new NATO members or the EU new members, we should always choose good business with Russia. In German, this old Lloyd George tenet, peace through trade, was changed into Wandel durch Handel, change through trade. The belief that trade with Russia would change Russia and Russian elites into liberal Western elites, that Russia turning European would be such a fantastic asset for Europe, blinded many Western European and American politicians to the perspective that Russian political elites are not changing into liberal European or Western political elites, but are still motivated by the post-Soviet, post-totalitarian ideological influences and patterns of behavior inherited straight from KGB, special police, which dominates actually politically contemporary Russia. And this particular elite is not changed by any trade. Well, There are many examples of this trade that exerts, I would say, pressure on European Western public opinion in order to accept political aggression of Russia as a minor evil in comparison with losing contracts with Russia, contracts for gas or contracts for building military equipment for Russia, as French shipyards are building now 2 powerful ships that could be used only to invade either Poland or Lithuania, or in the Black Sea, Georgia or Ukraine. And France builds actually these powerful ships for cocktails, actually, called Mistral, and offers them to contemporary Russia nowadays. And Germany decided to build a German firm, the most elaborated and the biggest, actually, military training center in the world for artillery for Russia, nowadays in Molino, near Moscow. And I can give more and more examples of this kind of deals that are very effective tools of making appeasement a very powerful attitude in contemporary, especially Western Europe. But the final and the last element that I should mention here is exactly the first one which I mentioned, the fear of war. After all horrors of the 20th century wars, not just the first one, but also the second one and all the subsequent wars, it is quite natural that not just Western European, but all societies, or most of societies, want to avoid war at almost all costs. Sometimes even at the cost of losing reason and reasonable assessment of political situation. And Russia, contemporary Russia, Putin's Russia, exploits this fear very, very effectively. How? By presenting to Western world not its peaceful intentions, no, quite the contrary, by presenting his tools of mass annihilation in order to, so to speak, instill among Western European and American public opinion this particular motto: the war with Russia is unimaginable, which means that whatever Russia, Putin's Russia, wants to take, she finally can take, because no war with Russia is imaginable. And with that particular motto that paralyzes any will of withstanding the Russian, stopping the Russian aggression, be it against Ukraine, tomorrow against Latvia, Lithuania or Moldova, and the day after tomorrow against Poland. Actually, this particular tool of presenting blue water navy, powerful navy, new strategic nuclear rockets, these are powerful tools of instilling this fear and changing this motto, no war is imaginable in Europe, in a most effective instrument of appeasement, of eliminating any reasonable thought about political and economic pressure also, not just military pressure, because military is not the only alternative to military moves of Russia, but also economic and political counter-movements are either minimized or totally rejected as provoking even a possible and distant perspective of a more real war. And this is how appeasement, an age-long now experience of European history, works to the detriment not just of Ukraine nowadays, I mean, once again, Crimea and eastern provinces of Ukraine, and not just of other Eastern European countries that are on the Putin's list of future, not so distant future invasions. But also Europe, the West itself, because the final goal for ideologically motivated, aggressive empire is not just retaking the old zone of influence, but to dominate anything that can be dominated. And those people who are ready only to give up, first at the cost of others, would be forced to face the situation when they someday will have to give up themselves. Thank you.